Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat? Well, I don't know that we could call it a purge within the Saints organization, but what started with firing of Pete Carmichael a couple of weeks ago continued over the weekend with the firing of offensive line coach Doug Marrone. That news came down over the weekend that after 2 seasons in his return to New Orleans, Doug Marrone will not be retained. There already apparently is a likely candidate to replace Doug Marrone, which we'll get into here in just a quick second. But I think one of the things that's pretty common whenever a team doesn't meet expectations is you have fall guys, and heads roll. A year ago, it was Dan Rauscher. I mean, it was like all that went wrong with that team that went 7-9 or 7-10, and Dan Rauscher was the guy that had it all laid at his feet. Poor guy. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna fire the run game coordinator because that's where the problems lie. Well, you got to have the pound of flesh, and Rauscher was the guy last year, and now it's Sneaky Pete and Doug Marrone. And the more people you keep letting go, the fewer people are remaining to point the finger at. Dennis Allen, Mickey Loomis. So Marrone, I think many people probably know Doug Marrone's backstory. Doug Marrone came to New Orleans on Sean Payton's first staff back in 2006, and he was the offensive coordinator. And he was the OC in 06, 7, and 8. And then he left to be the head coach at Syracuse in 2009. That's when Pete Carmichael was elevated from quarterbacks coach to offensive coordinator. So Marrone was at Syracuse. He became the Buffalo Bills head coach. He became the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach. And after his stint in Jacksonville, which ended in 2020, the COVID year, Marrone spent 1 year on Nick Saban's staff at Alabama as the offensive line coach. And then when Pete Carmichael was hired, when Dennis Allen was hired to be the head coach, they brought Doug Marrone back to New Orleans to be the offensive line coach. And that's where he's been the past 2 seasons. So a few things about Marrone. As I mentioned, every underachieving team has their fall guys. Rauscher last year, Carmichael, Marrone this year. But Doug Marrone probably deserves to be fired. When you look at the Saints' offensive line, it's probably the singular most disappointing unit on the roster, considering the amount of capital you've invested into your offensive line and the relative lack of production to that capital. Think about what the offensive line was when Doug Marrone was in New Orleans the first time. You draft Jari Evans. You draft Carl Nix. You draft Jermon Bushrod. You draft Zach Strief. You had all these hits in the draft. Boom, 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 boom. All of these hits, the guys, Jonathan Goodwin, you brought in Goodwin, all these guys that became the cornerstone of that amazing run to a championship and a team that for 3 or 4 years was the winningest team in the NFL. I mean, there was a time where you had the best guard tandem in the league with Evans and Nix. And Marrone was largely, to credit for that and was at the center of that. So you bring him back, and you're hopeful that you can find some of that juice again, and it just isn't there. This year, Pro Football Focus ranked the New Orleans Saints offensive line the 26th best unit in the NFL. 26 out of 32. Almost at the bottom. You're 21st in the NFL in rushing offense. Now, you allowed the second fewest sacks, which is kind of incredible. But maybe that speaks more to how you played the game offensively than how good your offensive line was. The Niners and the Rams allowed 34 sacks. The Saints allowed 35. So oddly, you're pretty good there as far as protecting your quarterback. Anyway, but look at the personnel. Ryan Ramczyk went from arguably the best right tackle in football to where he's now been an injury-prone guy who's nearing the end of his career. Cesar Ruiz, his Pro Football Focus grade this year was 51.2. He remains one of the lowest graded starting interior offensive linemen in the NFL. He just hasn't improved. Eric McCoy remains very solid at center. Andrus Peat is nearing the end of a disappointing career. James Hurst was a Band-Aid. He was brought in to be a rotational piece, a swing offensive lineman. He became your starting left tackle, which speaks to a lot of the issues you had. But maybe the biggest indictment on Doug Marrone over the last 2 years is Trevor Penning. I mean, you used a first-round pick on Trevor Penning. Now, Doug Marrone didn't draft Trevor Penning, right? Like, they don't go to the offensive line coach and say, hey, what do you think we should do with our first-round pick? But he's the offensive line coach. Used a first-round pick on an offensive tackle who basically has just become your tackle eligible, right? The guy that runs up to the ref and is like, number 70, reporting eligible. Like, that's what you're getting out of a first-round pick. And I understand Trevor Penning spent most of his rookie year injured. But he spent this entire offseason, training to be your starting left tackle. And after a handful of games, it was such a disaster, he was better suited on the bench as the tackle-eligible guy than playing anywhere meaningful snaps for this team. So, yes, the inability to develop Trevor Penning and I guess the equal lack of inability to develop Nick Saldiveri this year, does some of that blame does lay at the feet of Doug Marrone. I'm not saying he's the only guy, but there's expectations in the NFL, and people expect things to happen quickly, and that unit has been bad for 2 years under his leadership. So, yeah, it probably is time for a new voice to see if someone can come in and try to maximize the talent you have there. Now, the other problem is you need better talent there. Cesar Ruiz hasn't been good. James Hurst shouldn't be a starting offensive tackle. Andrus Peat only remained on this team because he agreed to take a pay cut and only really ended up starting because Trevor Penning was so bad. So, yes, you got to address your personnel also, undeniably. Really good players make coaches look really smart. But there was still an expectation to develop Trevor Penning, and that didn't happen. So, Doug Marrone is out, and I understand it. As much as we clowned on the decision to scapegoat Dan Rauscher a year ago, I understand the decision to move on from Doug Marrone. Now, Luke Johnson over at NOLA.com and The Advocate is reporting that longtime NFL offensive line coach John Benton has emerged as a top candidate for the Saints offensive line coach job. And he notes that Benton has a strong ties to the Kubiak-Shanahan tree. And as we know, Clint Kubiak is reportedly going to be the new offensive coordinator for the New Orleans Saints after the Super Bowl. Well, you're bringing in a guy here, apparently, in John Benton, who has a lot of experience and ties there. So Benton is 60 years old. He spent 15, 16 years coaching offensive line at the college level, moved into the pro level as an NFL offensive line coach in 2003, and he's coached NFL offensive lines every year since 2003. So you're talking about a guy with 20 years experience as an NFL offensive line coach at 60 years old. He actually also was the offensive line coach for the 49ers in 2019, the year they went to the Super Bowl and lost to the Chiefs 4 years ago. So this guy who's been around the league, been a lot of spots, been an offensive line coach, and has ties to Shanahan, Kubiak. So if you have someone who understands conceptually what you're trying to do, speaks the same language, then I understand it. I'm okay moving in that direction. But that is a unit that has got to improve. And I know that as we start to look at a lot of mock drafts, you see receivers and tight ends mocked to the Saints in round 1 at number 14. And I don't think that's a bad idea because the Saints have a lot of needs on the offensive side. But I honestly believe the biggest need on the offensive side is on that offensive line. Because if you shore up your offensive line, you give Derek Carr more protection. You pave the way for a running game, which was 21st in the NFL this year in rushing offense, especially with aging running backs. They need to improve their personnel on the offensive line as well, whether they do it free agency draft or some combination of both. Love to see that happen this year, and it'll happen apparently under a new offensive line coach who we think it looks like will be John Benton, according to Luke Johnson. Doug Marrone, after his second stint in New Orleans, this one for 2 years, is done with the Saints. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.